India-China relations have always been complex and difficult. India attained independence in China, founded the People's Republic within 2 years of each other, and started on a new course. For the first time in 1950, India and China had a border where both sides had troops actually in contact with each other. And as the world changed, they also changed. This relationship has never been easy to manage. It has both elements of competition and elements of cooperation. Because two large developing countries in Asia, neighbors, I think it's natural that they have a very difficult but also complex and productive relationship over history, and especially since they both became independent and masters of their own fate. For the last 30 years or so, they've had a modus vivendi between them, where basically the agreement was, and it was formalized during Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's 1988 visit, that difficult issues like the boundary on which they differ would be discussed, peacefully negotiated, but would not come in the way of developing the rest of the relationship, whether it was trade, whether it's economic relations, whether it's cooperating on the international stage, and that we would work together to expand the area of cooperation. And this worked. Boundary has been, by and large, peaceful. In 1993, both sides signed an agreement committing themselves to maintaining the status quo, not changing it, and where there were differences in interpretation and so on, to actually disengage and sit down and talk about the problems and talk them through. A whole series of confidence-building measures were put in place along the boundary. Equally, on the rest of the relationship grew very rapidly, and trade was somewhere around $2 billion in the beginning of the 90s, and now it's over $73 billion. Highly in China's favor, but it has grown tremendously, and investment has started too, and other kinds of economic relations too have started in the last few years. And the two countries have worked together on the international stage, on climate change, on issues like global trade issues. We have cooperated in the past. But again, we now, after about 30 years of this modus vivendi, which has worked well, we now seem to have come to a point where the relationship is under stress. The recent standoff between Indian and Chinese troops in the Doklam Plateau at the bottom of the Chumbi Valley is really the most recent instance, and it's been going on now for over a month. The last time we had incidents like this, or at least a standoff which lasted longer than a month, was, one has to go all the way back to 1986 to Sundarungchu, Wangdung, to think of a time when we had something like this. All the other instances since then where we had differences, we managed to sort out fairly quickly. There are other signs of stress. India, for instance, has misgivings about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which goes through territory which is Indian in Kashmir. From the Chinese point of view, they see Indian activism on issues like the South China Sea, which they think, frankly, they think of as the South China Lake rather than the South China Sea. And there are a whole host of issues. India wanted membership of the NSG, wanted Masood Azhar, who is a well-known terrorist, to be listed by the UN. China stood in the way, so India resents that. So there are a whole series of small issues, which, not small issues, serious issues, which both sides, for me, represent stress in the relationship. So what's the way forward? And why have we come to this pass? Why is the old modus vivendi not working? If you look around the world, or even through history, it's hard to think of any two countries which have changed as rapidly and as deeply as India and China have in the last 30 years. I can't think of another instance. And the result is that both countries, therefore, look at each other, look at the world, look at the region, and look at their own interests differently. Our own interests and our definition of our interests has expanded. China today lists South China Sea as a core interest, which she never did 10 years ago. For India, the South China Sea matters. When we started reform in 1991, about 18% of our merchandise trade, of our GDP was merchandise trade. By 2014, it was all the way up to 49.3%. That's dropped since. And more than half of that went east, which means it went through the South China Sea. So India's interest in freedom of navigation and security, maritime security in the South China Sea, therefore, is a recent development, but it's very important to India that these things be respected. So there are a whole host of new issues like this, which both countries will have to address. The simplest way, to my mind, is to actually sit down, talk these issues through, and to try and come up with a new modus vivendi. What would it consist of? It would have to include an accommodation of each other's core interests, which you would have to sit and discuss and see, and where that's difficult, to at least manage the differences between them. It would have to my mind, also address the boundary question and peace and tranquility on the border, which we have maintained so far, and if there are reasons on either side to try and change the existing patterns and so on, we need to do this together so that we can continue to keep the border peaceful. And it also needs to look at the periphery, because India's periphery is also China's periphery, and we are rubbing up against each other in various ways, which are not necessarily the ways we used to interact with each other in the past, when we had much less capability, both of us, and where our external engagement was much less. I think the basic point of any new understanding or strategic understanding between the two has to be built on the fact that for both of us, the outside world is much more important today than it was before. That we will both follow activist foreign policies, and that we will need to try and shape the environment around us, whether it's on issues like climate change, the global trading system, but also in terms of maritime security, counterterrorism, on the larger global issues. We will both seek to play a much larger role and to have a much larger voice in the institutions that manage global order. And that's something, that kind of change is something that we need to manage. So for me, it's more a question of managing change and managing it in the right direction, than just a question of taking individual interests and adjusting them or adjusting to each other. I think it can be done. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think it's a complicated process, but I think it's something that we owe to our own people, that we do, and we do well. Thank you.